Okay. All righty. Let's see what happens here. Am I coming into the room? Am I in the room? All righty.
What's the over-under? More than 5 minutes, you'll do a mic change?
Oh, the over-under on my mic change? I don't know. You know, I'm actually feeling like we're lucky that we have a mic. I had to go get a music stand. And I have to remember to take it back because the orchestra will be upset if so, yeah, that's where everything is right now. I've not seen that production. You've seen it. Yeah, my wife saw it. You've seen it? Yeah, I've not seen it. I will. I've prayed over the cast. But anyway. How's everybody doing? How are we doing tonight? You remembered me. You're back. You're all back. I was worried you'd forget. Since we were last together, lots happening. Lots happened. And I just want to start out saying that the Ukraine things, what's happening is really close to our hearts here. Jennifer and I went to a meeting of the ministries in Indianapolis that are in Ukraine, and all the people there just to pray together. And it was good to have like everybody who is working in the Ukraine together to see how we could work together. But you know, it's like we can pray and we can send money, but you just feel so helpless. And we're also getting information from people like in real time. And it's so that it's a constant, you're constantly being shuffled emotionally by what they're saying. And so we have a very close and personal, and many of our people in Grace have been to the mission to Ukraine, been to the various ministries there, and so we have a lot of people that are brokenhearted because they're putting faces to names. This is a very personal thing, and I'll pray for that in a minute when we pray. I just want you to know that this is one of those situations where I'm unsure about. We have records in the Scripture of God intervening in miraculous ways in situations that are terrible, and I would love to see something like that happen. And I know that many people are praying. I just really would like to see God do something specific. I know that a lot of times we are responsible for the actions, and He empowers us in the moments. But this is almost beyond. I just feel helpless. I don't feel hopeless. I feel helpless. So, also, it was interesting that the lady that was in charge of the meeting on Sunday evening said that we were not to let anybody know where the meeting was. It was like a very small population of people that knew about it because the FBI contacted them and said that Russian trolls are looking for ways to find people who are in the Ukraine connected to American money so they can find them and get them. And so they don't want us to, so you won't, like we're going to do some stuff in the service this weekend again, but we have video from people there, but we can't play it. Because once it's played, it's then put on our website, and while the Ukrainian people themselves don't seem to be concerned about that, we don't want to help anybody who might be out to kill people. And that's what it is. It's out to kill people. So anyway, I'll pray for that in a minute. And then, and it's just juxtaposition of this on our hearts on one side. And then we have this thing that we're doing that is purpose. The purpose of the musical is to bring joy to the community. I mean, we made a decision as a lead team some time ago to re-up doing these musicals because and we're going to have close to 10,000 people come through the musical. And we had 900 school children, was it, that would not have been able to see it. And we had 800 families from the care center get free tickets. And you talk about bringing joy to people, and it's just the juxtaposition. So I talked to Ken Ney, who's the head of Mission to Ukraine. Essentially, he's not the boss man, but he's the brains behind it. And he said, well, Tim, we have to live our lives. We have to live our lives. And he said, don't worry about the fact that you might find some joy or be giving people joy at this time, because all the Ukrainian people want is that joy to return. So, anyway, I'll pray for that in a minute. I do want to tell you that I have a very complicated summer schedule, and so I'm going to take a poll. And the poll is this: are you all willing to work with me on the weirdness of when I'll be here? And we'll meet and I'll make sure that everybody knows the schedule. Because here's the deal. I don't want to stop the class for 3 months because I'm not going to be here for 6 weeks of that. Does that make sense? So you all okay? Are you okay with that? I just want to, I'm getting a lot of nods because yes, because and just to be perfectly frank about it, quite some time ago, I had told the leadership here that I was retiring on the 6th of June. And so we planned a lot of stuff post-retirement. And plus we had that England trip that we planned 2 years ago that got shoved into this spring, and because of COVID, and we need to go on that thing, you know. And so it's like my family's having a family reunion in Washington State. And that's just going to cut me out of a class. And those kinds of things that I would not have naturally planned if I was just on a regular schedule. So thank you. I'll get you all the schedule. I think I can do that like in the next week, and then you'll know what's happening through into September. So good. We are in chapter 10, and as I recall, we stopped at we got through verse 3. Is that right? Am I right on that? This is a long, confusing passage to teach. It's not confusing others, but I'll start there in a minute. Let me pray for us, and then I'll read the passage, and we'll get going, because this is a passage that people fuss about. Yeah, that's what it's, yeah, okay. And I have a few things to say before we get into it, but let me pray first. Father, our collective hearts are heavy for what's happening in the Ukraine, not only to those people that we know and love, but to the millions of people who live in that country. I am just simply praying that you will do something, or you will empower someone or some ones or something to bring an end to this ridiculousness, this horrible affront. It's just an affront to the dignity of human beings, and that in some way we will see you work soon. We pray this from the bottom of our hearts, Lord. And also pray that as we look at your word, we'll be moved to take your call to us as your disciples very seriously, that in the difficult moments and in the joyous moments we will continue to give you honor. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, a couple of things. Well, I'll just read the passage, and then I've got a couple of things to tell you, and then we'll jump right into verse 4. Starting in verse 1, I'm just going to read the whole thing again. Then Jesus left Capernaum and went down to the region of Judea and into the area east of the Jordan River. And once again the crowds gathered around him, and as usual he was teaching them. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with a question: should a man be allowed to divorce his wife? And Jesus answered them with a question: what did Moses say in the law about divorce? Well, he permitted it, they replied. He said a man can give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away. But Jesus responded, he wrote this commandment not only as a concession to your hard hearts. He wrote this commandment only as a concession to your hard hearts. But God made them male and female from the beginning of creation. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one, since they are no longer two but one. Let no one split apart what God has joined together. Later, when he was alone with his disciples in the house, they brought up the subject again, and he told them, Whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery against her, and if a woman divorces her husband and marries someone else, she commits adultery. Now, I just want to stop and say, there is so much controversy about this, but one thing that is absolutely certain, and I want to get this out here in the beginning, is that the meaning of the words divorce, adultery, and even wife are completely different things than what we think. And we're going to get to that. But this is a highly first century cultural moment, and we need to know what the words that they're using that are translated this way mean, because they do not mean the same things in our world as they did in theirs. And I just want to start with you all knowing that, because we're going to have to go there. And some people are, like they say, well, there's a plain sense to the text, and you can read it. This is what Luther said. But Luther was reading from the Greek and the Hebrew. And so there is a plain sense if you know what the words mean. The problem is that we don't have words that mean what they meant. Does that make sense? We only have words that we can assimilate into the thinking. So I'm going to get to that. Also remember that this whole thing is a setup. That when it said that Jesus was on the eastern side of the Jordan River, that meant that he was still in Herod's territory. And this is so important to this passage. He's still in Herod's territory, and Herod and his wife had both divorced their mates, their wives and husbands, against all Jewish principles, and married each other. I mean, Herod had married his brother's wife. And so it was John, and I know most of you were here for that, but we just got to keep this in mind. It was John the Baptist's criticism of Herod's divorce that got him put in jail and killed. And there were two schools who had ideas about how, or what has to be going on in a marriage before a man can dismiss his wife, because that's what the word means. It means to dismiss your wife. It does not mean divorce her. It means just tell her to go away. And the two schools, one was very conservative, and they felt that it had to be for something as horrendous as fornication, which we'll get to also, because there is some stuff in Matthew about that we need to talk about. And then the other schools said, no, you can get rid of your wife and they listed stuff, and it always is, this is a list they always give, because these were the ones that were listed in the rabbinical writings: burning breakfast, not looking as beautiful as the woman you saw on the street, or aging poorly. These were givens. Bad breath in the morning. Also, I want you to know that until Moses gave this command about writing a thing, and I'll go into what that's all about in a minute, divorce among the Jews was purely a verbal issue. And again, divorce does not mean the process of going through a legal case to end a marriage. The word simply means to send away your property, to give someone else the right to use that which you had previously owned. All right? Now, and I'm just going to say straight up, when they list the property of a man in the Bible, it always goes like this: donkeys, sheep, cattle, wife. And that order is purposeful. And so remember, we are not talking about anything related whatsoever to the way we see. I'm just going to put it out there. Thank you, Jesus, for giving us permission to think of women as more than property. Because if we didn't have this stuff, much of the world still functions that way. Because they don't have Jesus, who came along and forced everybody to think about what God intended when he made man and woman. That's what this whole thing is about. And is this all making sense? This is all background. And I got to tell you, there aren't many people who want to have to do that kind of work to get to all this. Because it just says if you divorce or you commit adultery, they don't even know, most of the time people don't even know what adultery meant in their world. We'll get to that. It does not mean the same thing as it means in ours. What we need are new words. Interestingly, right at the beginning, he said, what did Moses say in the law? It's actually, what did he command about? And the word means sending away your wife. It means releasing her as property so that she is no longer singularly yours, but now available to become someone else's property, or they have the right to use her in the manner in which you use said property, as in a woman. Marriage is not a love relationship. It's a deal between father of the bride and maybe the groom, but usually the groom's dad. It's an economic contract. It brings families together in order to enrich them together, or to bring them business associations, or to give them more fields to work together or something. But it's not because Joseph and Mary love each other. They may, under most circumstances, have never been with one another until their wedding. All that to say, he says, what did Moses say about divorce? And then can you put up the next verse for me, Jeff? And it says, well, he permitted it, they replied. I'm just going to say straight up, they are absolutely right. He did permit it. He never says anywhere that it's okay. The assumption in the culture was that if a man was just done with this woman, he could just kick her out. Now, here's a problem with that. He kicks her out. What is she to do? Women were not allowed to be out in public on their own. They weren't allowed to work except within the domestic space of the home. Her children did not belong to her, so she leaves. If she has children, they stay with him. They're his property. She has to go. Her father is only obligated to take her back for 1 month. She might have a dowry, which was given by her family to her husband upon her marriage. That could be some money, any property like clothing, slaves, if she brought slaves into the marriage, yes, anything like that. They would have to give that back to her. But just think about the differences between a rich bride who has a big dowry and a poor bride who has next to nothing. It had been a verbal contract, when men were completely free, for almost any reason, to throw the woman out. And we know from secular writings that in the secular world and in the Jewish world, because the secular world did have, particularly by the time we get to Jesus' time, they did have laws. I think I mentioned this to you, that it was in 50 50 BC, that the Roman government finally made laws about divorce because it was so rampant and uncontrolled, and so many problems that were arising from women being cast off and men not doing anything and women not having any rights at all, that the Romans came along and said that you got to have a court where people have to go and women can divorce their husbands if they want to. But the Jews never were obligated to those rules. But way back with Moses, they weren't even obligated to do anything. Moses comes along, he says, or the text tells us in Deuteronomy, and he says, if a man is going to divorce his wife, he has to give her a certificate. And that's exactly what they said. Suppose a man marries a woman, but I think we put this up the last time too, having discovered something wrong with her, and boy, did they debate that. What's wrong with her? And he writes a document of divorce. The word is biblion. Biblion is the diminutive of the word biblios. Biblios means a book. It literally means, and you've heard me say this before and I love saying it, the exact length of a writing to be read as entertainment after dinner. That's why this is called the Bible, because it's made up of biblios, which are all about the same length, which is right for us to read as entertainment after dinner. I just put it out there. Anyway, biblion is the diminutive, which means a small book. But it actually, in their world, meant a small sheet of paper. Now it says, when she leaves the house, she is free to marry any other man. Yeah, well, that's not going to happen. I'm just going to tell you that women didn't have any right to go to some guy and say, will you marry me? Remember, marriage is a business arrangement. And so somebody's going to have to act on her behalf. And generally what happened was that men came along, and by the way, polygamy was not illegal. And they could say, I'll take you on, but here's why I want you in the house. And it might be that I just want you to clean the animals. Or it might be that I want you to be ready for me to come to your bed whenever. Or it might be that I need 3 more kids, and so I'll keep you if you keep making babies. This is the kind of thing that actually is happening. It says he writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends it away. Or if he dies, the first husband may not marry her again. In fact, that's the reason for this in the first place. Now here's the deal. The certificate of divorce was actually a business type of thing, because it said, I'm done with her, and she's free to marry anybody. And the reason they did that was because sometimes guys would kick women out, and they're out on the street and they find somebody that will take them in, and then they want them back. And they go find them living with some other guy, and they go, I never kicked you out. And it's like her word against his. You know, it did take 2 women against one man's word in any argument of any sort before in the Jewish world. It took 2 women for one man. So it's not her word against his. It's their word against his if she can find somebody else that they trust. Anyway, am I making sense on how? I'm just painting the picture into which this is going to. Yeah, this is mostly about the detestability of marrying a wife you kicked out to after she's married and the guy dies and you take her back. Anyway, if we go back to the passage, then the guys are right, the Pharisees are right. They say, he said a man can give his wife a written notice of divorce and release her, is what it literally is, release her, send her away. Again, Moses never says that divorce is a good thing. Or, yeah, go ahead and divorce your wife if you want to. Just make sure you give her a certificate of divorce. Now, the certificate had a couple of purposes. First purpose is the vast majority of Jewish men were illiterate. And it was against the law to teach a woman to read. So if a guy had to give her a certificate of a divorce, he'd have to find somebody who could write it down. And it took him time to go do that. Because you got to find the 1 in 10 who can write and who have a piece of paper around. Because that stuff wasn't exactly common. And then they'd have to write it out. And so it gave him time to think it through. Do I really want to do this? It also made it impossible for a woman who had that certificate to be accused of doing anything to leave him on her own or to go to another man on her own. Adultery, or in other words, pure fornication, and we'll talk about that word in a minute. Those kinds of aberrant sexual relationships, as they would have referred to them, were capital crime for women. So if a husband went and wanted his wife back, and if she didn't have that piece of paper that said she'd actually been thrown out by him, and she was married to another man, he could accuse her of a capital crime. Okay? We have one of the interesting thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls, have I talked about this? I just feel like I've been thinking about it to tell you about it for so long that I've said it a million times. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community had some people that divorced people. And guess what we find in with all the scriptures in there? We find certificates of divorce. We have them. There's one right there. This certificate of divorce dated, now look at it, 71 to 72. That's just a few years after Jesus. This is very current to what Jesus is talking about. I have the translation. Oh, there. It's Joseph, the son of Naxon, divorced Mary. Oh, no, that's just saying what it was. Let me find it. I've got it. I wrote it down. It says, I divorce and repudiate of my own free will, I, Joseph, son of Naxon, you, my wife Miriam, so that you are free on your part to go and become the wife of any Jewish man you please. These certificates did not have to state why. They just said, you're done. Those guys are right. That's exactly the rule. But Jesus has something to say. In the next verse he says, can you put the, he says, but Jesus responded, he, Moses, wrote this commandment. Now, again, Jesus asked, what did Moses command? They said nothing about commandment, really. He said he permitted divorce, and you had to do. So we don't have any commands on divorce. Jesus says he wrote the commandment, speaking to the fact that you have to write this stuff out, only as a concession to your hard hearts. Now we need to stop right there. I need to get to my notes because I want to say this word absolutely perfectly. The word hard heart or hard-heartedness, there's an interesting Greek emphasis in the language on the hard-heartedness of it. The way that it reads in the Greek in the order, he goes, for the hard-heartedness of you, he wrote to you this commandment. The you is them. The dudes he's talking to. Okay, does this make sense? He says, and the word, it's up there at the top. It's really hard to pronounce. It's sclerocardion. Sclerocardion. Now, sclerocardion is an interesting word. It actually means, cardion is the word for heart. A cardiac arrest, cardion, that comes straight from the Greek. And the sclero, the front end, is exactly what it sounds, a hard heart. This word is used in the Septuagint. That's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. I want you to follow me on this. It's found in the Septuagint. So when the Jewish scholars translated the Septuagint about 250 or 300 years before Jesus, from Hebrew to Greek, they used this word about people's hearts. We need to talk about that in a minute, too. It's also found in what is called Old Testament pseudepigrapha, which means writings that are credited to other people who they're not really by, and people are pretending to be them, but they're like given prophecies. We find it in the New Testament frequently, and we find it in the writings of the early Christian people. It is nowhere in any secular writings of any kind, any place. It is a purely Jewish idea. Remember, our hearts are not an emotional center in the Bible. It never is. When we think of somebody being hard-hearted, it's almost like they're not willing to warm up to you and emote with you, or they won't accept your coming to them and speaking. They're just hard-hearted, and it has something to do with an emotional level. This is not at all what the word means in that culture. The heart is always, and I know I've been banging on this, but this is so important to this right now, this subject. The heart is the center of the rational decision-making. And when Jesus uses the word, you were hard-hearted, and when it's used any place, remember, we use it all the time in the Christian world, but it was not a secular word. They didn't have an idea about this. The idea was that people had thought about something and made up their mind and locked down on a position, and they weren't going to think about it anymore, and that's where they were going to go. And where is it that they're hard-hearted? If you go back to the text again, it says a concession to your hard hearts, which means that men were unwilling to give up the right to treat women as their property and rid themselves of them at any moment for anything. That's what their decisions had been. And they were completely in agreement. Men were in complete agreement with that. So much so that God, through Moses, said, well, at least you've got to give women a sheet of paper that says they're free to marry and that you told them to go away. Is this making sense? This is really different than what we think about. This hard-heartedness is a Christian idea. It's a Jewish and now a Christian idea. And it means that we have come to a position that we refuse to listen to any other logic. That's way different than being emotionally disconnected. That is proactively choosing to ignore all other things. Okay? This is powerful stuff. It said, Moses gave you this commandment only as a concession to your hard hearts. And then Jesus does something that they certainly wouldn't have thought about at all. He shifts the entire conversation. Because when you talk about Moses with the Pharisees that are there, well, any Jewish person then, Moses is what? The lawgiver. Moses is the one who went to the mountaintop, was with God, heard the law given, dictated out to him, and then brought it back down to the Jewish people. Moses is the man. And Jesus is going to go, he's the man, but we need to go back to God and why he made people in the first place. Because the reasons that God made us outweigh the rules that he had to give us to keep us from destroying ourselves, which is what the law is really all about. It's saying what you should never do if you represent me, what you should never, ever imagine to do. And so Jesus goes right to this. He says, but God made them male and female from the beginning of creation. And now we're going right back to the beginning of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And Jesus is going to say something now that authoritatively overrides anything from Moses. And that's really powerful. That's really powerful stuff. He also, this passage in here, anything that he says about creation, anything he says about the relationships between men and women are direct quotes out of the Septuagint. He is starting out of the Greek. I'm going in and out, aren't I? I can hear me going in and out there a little bit. He is now quoting the text that all of the Pharisees use all the time. So there is no way that any of the Pharisees there did not know. I mean, I could start quoting the first 2 chapters of Genesis to you, and it will sound familiar to you. And they didn't have the fuss with, do we use this Septuagint or this one or this one or this one, like we do. Like it was back in the day when nobody used anything but the King James. You started to quote the first chapter of Genesis, everybody could kind of follow along because they'd heard it all the time. And that's exactly what he does right here. He uses text in a way that they cannot say they don't know it. Okay? But were you just standing up, Cindy, or were you what? The mic's okay. Yeah, okay. He says, God made male and female from the beginning of creation. Now that in and of itself starts out going back to what was God's intention for men and women when he made the world. From the beginning of creation, God had intended for there to be men and women who lived together. Now, we can put the next verse up, I guess, Jeff. And this is from chapter 2. A man leaves his father and mother and joy. What he's doing is he's forcing them to think about all that is included in the first 2 chapters of Genesis when it comes to what God intended for men and women to live like. He said he made man and woman at the beginning of creation. And then he says this. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife. And the two are united into one. Now, can I just talk about that a minute? And then you need a break from me. I think I've been a little heavy-handed. Have I been heavy-handed with you today? I just feel like I think maybe I've had 2 weeks to think about this, so it's like. And I wasn't out of town last Tuesday. I was just sitting at home going, what am I doing with myself tonight? So anyway, do you guys know, that God did not take a rib out of Adam when he made Eve? That story does not say that he took a rib out of him. It actually literally says he took half of his size, half of his body out. It's like from your shoulder to your hip. He just took all the parts of a man that generates everything that makes us humans. Because remember, where is all of our humanity coming from? All of our thinking about things and our emotions and it's all coming out of our intestines. And so it's like he just took half of that out and he made a woman out of it. Now, the Jews were the reason that we have rib is because the translators of the King James were very confused about the fact that it's a half a person that he took out. And so we get a rib because it's a lot easier to work with it. that's just an aside. There's a lot of that stuff, by the way, like the inn in Bethlehem. There's no inn in Bethlehem, but that's neither here nor there. They just didn't know what to do with that wacky word because they just didn't know what it meant. So anyway, so now we've got this thing, and here's the deal. The Jews had all kinds of notions about Adam. Some thought that some are somewhat phantasmagorical, like Adam was created originally with two faces because he had to have male and female, because he was, the word they use is bisexual, which actually means that he could reproduce in himself. And there are some animals in the lower levels, but they didn't know about that then, but that can reproduce without two genders. But anyway, they had all these ideas, like he started out like that, so that when he pulled half of him off, that then the Eve was that half that he ripped away and made it, and it's that kind of stuff. But they have all sorts of, and I think I mentioned, I'm reading a book. Did I tell you I'm reading a book that's so complicated that it's like I've gotten like 12 pages in. It's like so exciting for me. Well, the first 12 pages have all been about the original Adam concepts, and it fits right into this. Because here's the deal. It doesn't really matter how they thought about it. What God intended was for, he says, the man leaves his father and mother. Now, think about why that's important, because men did not leave their fathers and mothers. Women came out of their homes and into the family of the husband. She became the husband's property within the community of her husband, which means he's talking about a leaving, which does not have to do with physically leaving, but having something to do with uniting with her. And he says, and he is joined to his wife. The Jews were right on this, and they're not thinking sexually. Husband and wife are an image of going back to Eden and the original concepts of Adam, one thing perfectly put together that God calls what? He says everything else is good, but he calls that very good. The idea in God's mind when he first thought about populating the creation that he had was to have people living in a way that they were as if they were one thing. Everything about the description of their lives together. When it says they were naked and knew no shame, naked has two meanings. It means to be physically without clothing, and it also means to be completely open and known. And without shame means that nothing has ever come in to you that makes you question your dignity or your value. Or we can go on and on about what shame takes away from us. And it said they had none of that. And we just make it up like, well, they were walking around with no clothes on and they just didn't care. That has nothing to do with it. It's the lowest thing on the totem pole in terms of what God expected his people to live in a manner. And Jesus says, this explains what he made male and female, and this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife. And every one of those Pharisees standing around there had been in tons of conversations about what it was supposed to be like, but they had very hard hearts, and they wanted to be able to kick that woman out of the house if they so desired for any reason. And so they just weren't going to think about what God really wanted. Does this make sense? You need a break, but I think this is really powerful stuff. Okay, take 5 minutes and we'll come back. Iron to get out of here to get to see either Purdue play Wisconsin or to see the State of the Union. So I'll have you out of here, okay? It's like Yeah, my wife just told me that they got word that Zhytomyr, the town where Mission to Ukraine is, they're bombing it. They bombed the hospital, and they're bombing residential areas. So, yeah, they bombed the hospital. So. Oh yeah, yeah, he is. Yeah, he is. Yeah. Okay, that's the hard-heartedness of men. That's what this is. Yeah. I just want to back to this. Just one quick thing. We have to remember that their hard-heartedness about the notion that they should be allowed to divorce their wives whenever has almost nothing to do with the wives being human beings. This is a property issue. That a man should be able to use his property in the manner that he so chooses, and that when he gives her the certificate, it means that he is no longer claiming the rights to that property. It would be no different than trading off a donkey. You know, I've said I don't want this donkey anymore. You can have this donkey if you want it, and I'm not going to use that donkey anymore. Women, the use of that as property for women was their sexual services, the childbearing, service around the house, those sorts of things that they felt that women were obligated to them because they were their property. And if they didn't want that anymore, if it was something about them they didn't want around anymore, then they were this is the reason that they were hard-hearted about it, because they're not talking about someone that they deeply care about necessarily. I will say this. When we get, and maybe you've heard me say this before, but when we get stories like the parents of John the Baptist, what were their names? Elizabeth and Zechariah. It was by law a man could put his wife out for not having a child within the first 7 years of marriage. When we get an older couple where the husband has kept a wife who has not had any children, this is a great statement of his character, because he has chosen to remain with a woman who has not lived up to the primary obligation of a woman in the world, which is to bear children. And he had every right or an expectation under the law, which would be not the Mosaic law, but the other forms of the way they ruled their community, that would be expected that he get rid of her and start over with somebody else. And yet he keeps her into old age. Anytime you run into that, just remember that it's making a tremendous statement about the character of the man and the depth of their relationship, which again takes us back to the intentions of God at creation. Now, can you put the passage back up for me, Jeff? Wherever we were. He says, since they are no longer two but one. Oh, that 9 looked like a G. Let no one See, that thing is, this is going back to God's intentions. That God's intentions are this. He says, let no one split apart or separate. That word separate then actually is far closer to the word that men wanted to be able to do with their wives, which was to separate themselves. But don't let anybody separate or split apart what God has joined together. Now, I'm just going to put it out there. Nobody had ever said that before. Nobody. Divorce was not an issue. They weren't arguing about whether people could divorce, whether the men could. women couldn't, unless I think, you know, I know I've told you this, that there was if a woman could prove that her husband's work made him so smelly that she couldn't get around him, she was allowed to separate from him. But other than that, that was like the only thing she could do. But he was saying, let no one split apart. Let no man, is what it literally says in the Greek. Let no man separate what God has joined together. Because when you say no one, this is one of those great moments when the translators of our version are trying to be gender neutral. But this is one place where putting it in as man would be helpful, because only men could separate what God has joined together. Now, what happens when Jesus says this, we do not know? We don't get a response from anybody. Now, I will say, we do need to step back and say, Matthew remembers this entire incident very differently. Matthew remembers what Jesus is about to say to the disciples as being said to the Pharisees. And he also remembers a caveat that Jesus adds to this that we'll talk about later. It's just an interesting shift. He has a very different memory of what happened. And I'll just say that Mark is given precedent, as they say, which means that Mark was first written. And that and Matthew clearly used Mark to write his gospel. He clearly quotes it. But it is interesting to me that in this instance, he disagrees with Peter's memory. We'll talk more about that later. Am I going in and out again a bunch? Can you follow me? I just want to make sure you can follow me. It's interesting that in Matthew, the only people that respond to what Jesus says are the disciples, and they say something right then. But we don't get it. Like, there are a couple of things, like the Pharisees could have thought, this young man is out of his mind. They could have thought that. He's 30. Who does he think he is? Or they could have thought, boy, he doesn't know the law, does he? Something like that. They could have thought that, well, he's never been married, so he sure doesn't know why we all want this rule. It's like that. They could have thought that. I don't know. But we don't get anything out of them. The story there ends. So we don't know how they felt about it. We do know that their intention was to get Jesus to say something that would make Herod mad or make one of the rabbinical schools mad. And Jesus doesn't really give them anything to work with here. He has gone back to Genesis and said, you guys all need to start thinking about what God intended in the first place. And there was a lot of dignity between men and women there. And he wanted something that has got nothing to do with you all making a decision to separate from your wife so you can be with a younger, prettier girl. That's what's happening here. But we don't get any response from the Pharisees. But we do know that what Jesus said highly confused the disciples. Because it says, can you put the next passage up? We're going to get through this. That's pretty cool. We're going to get through this. Can you stay with me for 15 more minutes? I think we can get through this. Yeah. This is later, when he was alone with his disciples in the house. Now, we have no idea whose house it is, because they're on the east side of the Jordan and somebody let them stay there. I can see that. They say, hey, Jesus, you want to stay at our house? And he goes, yeah, but I got 12 guys with me, and you take us all in. Okay. This is very common. It's very normal in rabbinical teaching for rabbis to say something that the disciples don't understand, but they don't question the rabbi about it until later when they're alone, because for two reasons. One, if it grew out of an argument or a discussion with somebody who seemed to be opposed to them, then they didn't want to question anything publicly because it might look like they agreed with the people who were bringing up the question. So the disciples don't question him in public because they don't want the Pharisees to go, his disciples don't even agree with him on that one. Or it can also be that they don't want to shame their rabbi in public by questioning what they might have to say. So this is normal. It's very normal for later when they're alone to talk in the house. And we've seen this already, and we'll see it some more. So as they brought up the subject again, yeah, that's essentially what it says. It's like, I can hear their question. Wait a minute. Now, Jesus, did you really say that men should not separate what God's brought together? Are you really saying that God brings people together when two fathers make a business deal to give us our wives? You know what I'm saying? It's like this brings up all kinds of cultural issues. And there's not any teaching about it, particularly. I mean, there is one school that thinks that there has to be adultery in order to divorce your wife, but that wasn't the popular school. That was the strict school. But anyway, it's like he told them, and what he's about to say is, I'll just say, whoever separates or sends away his wife and marries someone else commits adultery against her. All right, adultery. Men could not commit adultery against their wives by law. A wife is property. You cannot do anything, because remember, wait. Adultery actually means to use the services of someone else's property, or to give someone else the services of a person's property. The word that is I won't go there. We'll go that when we get to Matthew. So he says adultery. Well, men can't commit adultery. They can't deny the services that they have to their wives. They don't have any expectations of services. The wife is expected to give him these services, but what could he possibly do that denies her what she has coming to her? Because she's just I suppose if he starves her to death, he should feed her, but that's about where we go. I mean, sexually or attention-wise, why should she expect anything? That's not what this is about. She can deny him her services by giving them to someone else. The most common problem was, and where the people got most upset, was if another man came in and had a relationship with a man's wife, that committed adultery to the husband, because he was taking the services that were due this guy away from him. All right? And also, and I know if you've been with me for a long time, you know about this too. Their idea of how children were born was that men put little people into women. And the women had eggs inside of them for those little people to eat. And when men put those little people in there, they never went away. And so no man could ever know that a child born from his wife who'd had sex with another man was actually his forever. And so he's denying the husband the right to know that his property is giving him offspring, which becomes his property. Does this make sense? Men only commit adultery to other men. And that word doesn't mean anything like that to us. And women can commit adultery by denying the husband's services. But I can't, as a husband, I can't do this to my wife. Now, what Jesus says is, anyone who divorces his wife and marries someone else. Now, remember, why would they send their wife away? Because there's just something about them they just don't like anymore. And they found somebody else they want to do this to. And he's actually saying, then they're committing what? They're denying that which is owed to the wife from them. And he's saying, you need to rethink what the relationship is supposed to be. And if a woman divorces her husband, now he says this as now there are lots of scholars who think this is a later addition, that this isn't in the original text, because women couldn't divorce their husband and marry someone else. Women could commit adultery in their mind, which, by the way, was a what? A capital offense. So if a woman got caught in adultery, that story about Jesus and the woman being caught in adultery, that thing that we're not really sure is true, but what did they come out to do? They're going to kill her. That's true. This is a very strong, almost hyperbolic statement on Jesus' part, meant to do one thing, and that is to jack his disciples into the thinking that they better take how God intended men and women to live and how they treat their wives in such a manner that they reflect God's original intentions as opposed to that where the culture had gone. You need to really think about this. And what he's suggesting is to live completely against the cultural norms of everything. That you talk about raising the dignity of women. This is one of the most powerful statements on it. The whole business is completely separate from that which we think about what happens between people in our world today. But the principle is still the same. The equal dignity in the union. In Matthew, Jesus adds a caveat. He says, anyone who divorces his wife, and he says, except for, and the word is generally translated, oh, we got it, there we go, this guy's on it. I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery unless his wife has been unfaithful. That's really nice. The word is porneia. The word for prostitute is porneia. I forget the exact Greek word. The word for prostitute is that. That means someone who gives the rights, gives to someone that which should only be one other person, who gets paid to give the rights that should be a single person. To commit adultery, or to commit prostitution is almost the same word. And this word here is the wife who has been, and that's the word for someone who is acting out prostitution, which is the giving away of that which should be one person's singular right to anyone for some other thing. This is a very clear concept in their world. But what it's talking about, and I just want to get right to it. This is about unrepairable bond breaking. Unrepairable bond breaking. In their world, and the way Jesus talks is that this is the one thing that is an unrepairable bond break. It's when you give away that which you owe only to your husband in this manner. Now, this would have, there's almost no chance that a wife would do this. Women were never in public alone. They were never in public without other women. The whole thing is just like, we just do not have a concept of what it would be like to be those women and living in that world. It's almost impossible to talk about it. When I talk about this stuff to high school kids, you should see them freaking out when I say the stuff that I say about the context of the relationships that people had. But here's the deal. I'm convinced that if Jesus were here today and sang this for the first time, that he would talk in ways that we understood was unrepairable bond breaking. That he would talk that way. That there are ways, we have such a much grander sense of the dignity of people. And there are ways that, I'll just be honest, I have personally gotten Grace Church to pay to hide wives from their abusive husbands and paid for the lawyers to get them divorced. Why? Because a man who beats his wife and beats his children has broken the bond in a manner that it is unrepairable. We just have to remember that these particular statements by Jesus are spoken into a world that had no sense of broader dignity in marriage or psychological aspects of things. It's all the stuff that we have come to learn that are important in what it is to be faithful. Do I recommend that people just see divorce as one possible way to have problems go away? No. And I've very, very rarely recommended divorce. But when it's clear that one party is treating the other party as if they are property who have no dignity and it is an unrepairable break in the bond, I cannot imagine that God wants anything other than that injustice to stop. God hates divorce. Why? Because he said it under the circumstances that we were talking about at the beginning of this. And why does he hate it? Because of all the injustice and the pain and the suffering that it brings into people's lives, particularly the children. Think about the children in that world. They are the property of the husband. And the purpose of a woman was to have as many children for a man as she could. And let's say she has 5 and he's done with her, and those 5 kids get their mother tossed out on the street, and they are stuck with him. That's why God hates divorce. That's why God hates divorce. And when it says God hates divorce, it never specifically says, and so you must never do it. I see it as here's a problem. We have a statement like this from Jesus, and it is so cut and dry in English. It's just easier to say, well, that's the way it's going to be. And I know of churches on the north side, that's where they stand. I don't care what he does to you. You can't divorce him. And if you marry him, you're living in adultery. I will say this. There's a really great commentary series called the Sakrapajana. Sakrapajana is a Catholic commentary, and it's amazing in its depth and its just scholarship. And I thought, oh my goodness, they're just so hardcore about this subject. I wonder what I'm going to get when I read this Catholic thing. And I put some quotes in my notes. I was stunned at just the general tenor of what they had to say, because they tended to agree with the kinds of things that I'm saying. And their position was that we need to be very careful when we start talking about this subject. We need to be very sensitive to who we are in the world and what is it that is important for us as followers of Jesus, as disciples of Jesus, to live out. And the most important aspect of the marriage is that it looks like what Adam and Eve are shown to have had when they come together. But we are not to buy into the loose notions of relationships having no particular meaning, but we certainly aren't to buy into the notions that simply because people have been brought together in a civil service, they are somehow obligated to live in a situation that God would call nothing close to what he intended for us. I just got to leave it at that. Now, you can disagree with me, but it's just, I'm a pastor. I deal with it all the time. Have I seen instances of healing? Absolutely. I have a friend who his wife lost her mind. I don't mean that like in like a medical way, but just ran off with the builder of their new house and spent 3 years living like a complete maniac. And I fasted one day a week for 3 years with a friend, praying that she would come to her senses. And one of the happiest days of my life was when she came to her senses and came home, and Dave Rod remarried them. But that's really rare. That's really rare. So, anyway. You okay? Everybody okay? This is serious stuff. Next week it changes, The one interesting thing, though, is we go right from this passage into Jesus talking about how important children are. Now, why do you think that they would be back to back? Because God hates divorce, because one of the things he hates is what it does to children. And one of the things that it does to children is it makes them meaningless, and it makes them just a part of the property exchange, and they don't have any feelings. And then what do the disciples do? They say, go away, children. And then Jesus says, stop that, bring them in, because they're what? They're important. Okay, that's good. I'll see you next week, guys. Thank you, thank you, thank you.